Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for some of you. Thank you very much for being with us today. My name is Franco Passacantando. I am the scientific advisor of Istituto Affari Internazionali, and I've been asked by the Italian Ministry of Economy and Finance to coordinate a research project on the topic of local infrastructures and to organize a series of events on this topic in the year of the Italian presidency of the G20. This is the second and most important event we have organized so far, and others will follow. The two speakers who will introduce our webinar today are the President of Istituto Affari Internazionali, Ambassador Ferdinando Nelli Feroci, and the Director General for International Financial Relations of the Ministry of Economy and Finance, Mrs. Gelsomina Vigliotti. I hand it over to you, Ferdinando.
Thank you, Franco, and welcome to all participants wherever they are. I understand from your presentation that some of you are in Asia. And I would like to, first of all, to thank Gelsomina Vigliotti, not only for being with us today, but for her personal involvement in this project. As Franco said in his introductory intervention, this event is part of a project that the Istituto Affari Internazionali is developing in collaboration with Bruegel, but with the support of the Ministry of Economy and Finance, and also with the personal participation of some of its officials. This project is meant to provide a contribution of analysis, but also of policy recommendations to one of the items of the agenda of the G20, which this year will be chaired by Italy, by Italian government. And everybody is aware that among the various challenges that the G20 is facing this year, certainly probably one of the most important is to define a strategy to relaunch international cooperation and multilateralism in a period where the world is still confronted with the pandemic and with the consequence, the economic and social consequence of the pandemic. I think it's common sense to imagine that a central focus of the agenda of the G20 under the Italian presidency will be on the idea to define a concerted strategy to stimulate sustainable and inclusive growth and employment. Now, in this context, infrastructure, and in particular investment in infrastructures, have been for years one of the central issues of the agendas of the G20. But this year, this very subject is probably even to be more important than in the past because of the social consequences of COVID-19. Now, at this stage, it's not clear when, how, and to what extent world economy will recover, at what speed. But we are aware that national governments and international institutions are working on the definition of strategies to restart long-term growth. A key factor, inevitably, of these strategies will be the capacity to mobilize, stimulate, and even reorient investment in infrastructure. It is, of course, the case for nationwide or transnational infrastructures, both physical and material, which will be inevitably a major component of this agenda. But investment in local infrastructures are particularly important because social needs, work habits, production patterns have been greatly, deeply affected by the pandemic. And so local infrastructure and investment in local infrastructure will be crucial, both to address the short-term needs to sustain recovery, but also to address long-lasting or long-standing problems, such as, for instance, climate change or social exclusion. So today's seminar will be the occasion to present and discuss a paper which has been prepared by the Istituto Affari Internazionali, and which will focus in particular on the question of local infrastructures. In March, within this project, there will be another event where Bruegel will present his contribution to the project with a paper focused on green investment. Today, the focus will be on public policies issues such as, for instance, measures to improve the enabling environment needed by subnational local entities, local communities to reduce risks and promote a more resilient growth, but also on fiscal and regulatory instruments needed to subnational entities to promote investments in infrastructures. And last but not least, on financial instruments capable of mobilizing resources needed to create infrastructures. So I would conclude my very short remarks by thanking once more Gelsomina Vigliotti and his team, Franco Passacantando, who has been the scientific and is the scientific coordinator of this project, Nicola Bilotta and Alberto Pozzollo, the author of the paper which will be discussed today, and all the participants who have accepted our invitations. Thanks, buon lavoro, as you say in Italian, and Gelsomina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I'm particularly pleased to stay here today together with the Ambassador Nelli Feroci, with Franco Passacantando, and all other people who worked for this event. As you know, actually, as Ambassador Nelli Feroci said, we decided already several months ago to work together with the Istituto Affari Internazionali to develop this infrastructure agenda. You know, the infrastructure agenda, it's very high on among the priorities of the finance track of the G20. And actually we wanted someone supporting us in developing ideas to push forward this topic, which is particularly relevant, as already said, at this particular juncture where we have to foster the growth, the recovery, and we all know that infrastructure could be a main driver of growth, of job absorption. It can support sustainability and also foster inclusion. So let me go ahead with my notes, and I would like to start by saying that recognizing that the G20 countries, many of them have reacted to the pandemic with exceptional stimulus packages to address the emergency, including infrastructure plans to stimulate the recovery. In our view, the current juncture should be seen as a window of opportunity to reflect on new paradigms, foster transformation growth, and deliver the broad-based prosperity in the post-COVID world. With this in mind, we have structured our G20 infrastructure work plan around 4 main pillars. First, resilient infrastructure. Second, digital infrastructure. Third, sustainable infrastructure. And fourth, inclusive infrastructure. Today's event is organized under the umbrella of the social inclusion pillar. I think that we all agree that we should encourage more inclusive infrastructure investment. The pandemic has shown how necessary is the inclusive dimension of our infrastructure systems today, given the significant implication of the crisis on regional and local communities. Indeed, the infrastructure should be designed to smooth differences across territories and improve the inclusion of the most vulnerable groups. To secure an inclusive recovery in which no one is left behind, looking at the experience of local entities whose policies are traditionally the closest to the citizens' needs and preferences, could provide an alternative bottom-up perspective and can create positive spillover effects also at aggregate level. More attention should also be paid to rural areas. In a world where cities are continuously evolving, we cannot allow rural areas to be marginalized and left behind. We should avoid the depopulation of some areas and, on the other hand, the excessive congestion of urban centers. To this purpose, we also need to rethink the urban spaces, restoring and reusing areas and giving them back to people with improved services. Let me underline that this approach is fully aligned with the vision proposed by the Italian G20 presidency, which revolves around 3 pillars, the so-called 3 Ps: people, planet, and prosperity. Today, our intention is to promote a discussion on financing local transformative infrastructure, given that local governments are responsible of most of infrastructure investments in many G20 countries. Local authorities provide a wide range of essential services concerning education, social, and healthcare. Ensuring and encouraging adequate financing to these entities is crucial. Governments should encourage a better use of limited resources available in order to improve the quality of social infrastructure projects. To this end, the national authorities should improve their policies to direct private sector funds at subnational level, invest better, and increase the quality of infrastructure systems, and this is key. First of all, government should understand which financing strategy is the most appropriate to invest in each sector of infrastructures delivered at a local level. There are several obstacles that do not allow an efficient and effective public and private investment in local infrastructure, as poor procurement practices, low employees planning skills, sometimes corruption, and low coordination among national, regional, and local levels. The aim of today's workshop is also to focus on the problems that are typical of local infrastructure financing and stimulate a discussion on how to support and strengthen the quality of the local infrastructure delivery. Let me conclude by saying that the main deliverable of our agenda in social infrastructure will be a high-level conference on local infrastructure to be held in September, and I really hope that it can happen in presence, which will include the inputs from this workshop as well as the other workshop which has been scheduled for March and which will be also organized together with the International Affari Institution and the think tank Vogel in Brussels. Let me conclude by saying that we are honored to have you all here today online with us to this webinar, and we look forward to your valuable input to stimulate the G20 discussion, not only today, but through the course of this year. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you, Ferdinando. Thank you, Gelsomina. I would like now to say, first of all, a few words on how we have structured this conference. But before doing that, let me inform you that we have just released the background paper that has been written in preparation for this conference by Professor Alberto Pozzolo and Nicola Vigliotti from IAI. The link to the paper will appear in the chat, at least that's what I'm told, and I hope it works. It is work in progress, and we will be happy to receive any comment or suggestion based on your experience or knowledge that you would like to share with us. So how did we structure this conference, this webinar? Well, the first point that we would like to address is to better understand the economic and social consequences of the crisis which has hit the global economy. We all know and we see with our eyes how this crisis has radically changed the way people work, the way we live, the way we travel, for those of us who still travel. Now, the most visible impact of the crisis is on the places where we live and on cities. Cities have also seen an unprecedented increase in poverty. And according to the World Bank, the pandemic will create between 143 and 163 million new poor worldwide. And the new poor are projected to be more likely to live in urban areas. So the issue of social inclusion that is part of the priority of this G20 is crucial to this, to the focus that we are giving to cities. But also cities are at the center of the green transformations, because cities is where more than 70% of greenhouse gases are produced. And so what cities can do to improve their environmental standards can greatly contribute to the climate agenda worldwide. Now, of course, the crisis is still unfolding, and it is very difficult to make predictions on how much and to what extent the transformations we see today will be long-lasting. Most importantly, how much the digital transformation will change the way we work, the way we buy goods, the way we travel. Now, to better understand this, we have asked Professor Andres Rodriguez Pose to play the role as lead speaker in this conference. Andres is professor of economic geography at the London School of Economics and has a long track record of research on regional growth and inequality. He has pioneered the research on the lagging behind areas of the world, or on what he calls the places that do not matter, and where unfortunately people do not see the future for themselves. He also has been awarded important prizes for his contribution to the understanding of regional disparities and development. Recently, he has done specific research on how the COVID crisis will change the structure and morphology of cities, suburbs, and metropolitan regions, and to what extent these changes will produce long-lasting transformation. So, Andres, I hand it over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Many thanks, Franco. It's a pleasure to be with all of you and in such large numbers. I would like to thank the Istituto Affari Internazionali and the Italian government for this invitation. It's very nice to be at this G20 meeting, and I hope that the hosting of the meeting will be a great success. Franco Passacantando asked me to focus much more in my presentation on the work that I have been doing on regions and cities in a post-COVID world. That is work that most of it is joint work with Michael Stolper from UCLA and Richard Florida from the University of Toronto, and to try to link it to my previous work on infrastructure and the impact of infrastructure for the development of cities and regions. And well, needless to say, we all know that we are all living in very turbulent times, and that we have a massive pandemic that has shaken the world, and it's having significant geographic implications. Let me start by saying that, of course, COVID-19 is not the first global pandemic, but is the first to do so in a much more connected, digital and globalized world. We have to go back a century to see a similar pandemic, but the pandemic of 1918 to 1920, this so-called Spanish flu, was something that happened in a very different world. And it's a pandemic that has expanded so rapidly and so fast because of, so widely across the world because of the greater connectivity with cities, and especially large cities, which are the main hubs, the places where international travelers come and go, but where that have become these hubs of the pandemic with the big density and agglomeration that has helped expand this illness, COVID-19, worldwide. And by many, as a result of this, and as a result of the relatively lengthy lockdowns that we are all enduring wherever we are, it is being considered by many as a turning point in the territorial distribution of economic activity, in the territorial distribution in the medium and long term, perhaps, of wealth. Many have heralded the pandemic as perhaps the death of the large city as we know it. Are large cities going to continue post-2021, post-2022, once we start recovering, having the same role as catalysts of economic growth as they had before? Is the pandemic, with all its negative toll, with all its the problems it's generating, but does it represent an opportunity for a more balanced growth in which areas that have been left behind, areas that in many cases where did matter or mattered less than they did before, can play a new role in a more balanced, let's say, territorial and equitable territorial development? And this is something, are we going towards a new flat world? So is the prediction that Thomas Friedman did in 2005 going to be materialized in this post-pandemic world? And in order to do that, we have to understand what have been the drivers of the pandemic. There's a massive amount of research that has been ongoing about what are the factors behind the pandemic. There are a few areas in which most people agree. It's affecting the most connected places more than anywhere else. It's being diffused through strong density in places where you have a lot of people, a lot of crowdedness. Then it leads to a greater impact of the pandemic, affecting in many cases the poorest and more unequal society. The poorest of the poor within our societies, and especially in unequal societies, is associated to different types of climatic conditions, but also to greater levels of pollution. And the response of our institutions, the response of our governments is playing an important role. Greater polarization, lack of coordination is behind, in many cases, what have been responses that have left until now a lot to be desired, depending on country and even within countries. But even if there is some agreement on the drivers, what we have is that we're still struggling to understand how it goes. This is a map of regions in Europe, and this is the incidence in terms of excess mortality over the previous 5 years of the pandemic. During the first wave of the pandemic, and between January and the end of June 2020, in terms of excess mortality across regions. And what we find is that there's a very, very uneven geography. There are places where there has been either no excess mortality, the whole of Norway, most of Finland, for example, many parts of Central and Eastern Europe, at least in the first wave. And there are other places where there has been significant concentration. The worst hit part of Europe has been the region of Madrid, but also Castilla-La Mancha in Spain. Lombardy in Italy is another case, but also other big cities like Paris, London, Stockholm, but also outside big cities, the northwest of England, the area around Maastricht, the area of Alsace in France. So it's a very, very type of different geography in which different actors and cities might play a role, but it's not always the same role. For example, let's take the 6 regions in Europe with the biggest incidence. In fact, many of them are cities or host big cities. It's the city of Madrid with the biggest incidence, with high concentration in the late month of March and early April. Lombardy with Milan, another large agglomeration. London, Catalonia with Barcelona, and the city of Stockholm, albeit at lower levels. Castilla-La Mancha is a more, let's say, rural, but also mid-sized city region, relatively close to Madrid, that had a lot of incidents. But not all the big cities have been harboring big numbers, at least during the first wave. We take a look at other regions in Europe. What we find is that places like Copenhagen, places like Warsaw, places like Lisbon, Berlin, Lazio with Rome, and Campania with Naples, that all host large cities, had a very, very low incidence in comparison to what we saw elsewhere. Other factors are also important to look at, and what happens within cities. I think that Franco in his introduction made a clear indication that what happens within cities is also important to know. And this is a map of New York and the incidents during the first 6 months of the year of the pandemic. Here, there's a link on the one hand to places that are close to airport hubs. JFK, you can see a bigger incidence in terms of cases, in terms of deaths. LaGuardia Airport, also a big higher incidence, but also in poorer areas of the city, the less favored, those that have been left behind, those that have been at the bottom of the income scale in places like the Bronx, for example, or in the eastern parts of Brooklyn are suffering far more, have been suffering far more from the incidence of the pandemic. But this is also not universal, because this relationship, which is very clear in the case of New York between income and incidence, so richer areas in Manhattan have suffered much less than poorer areas in the Bronx, is not something that we see universally. If we go to, for example, Madrid and London, the incidence geographically is very different. It affects some rich areas in the case of Madrid, also some in the case of London. So it's very uneven, and we don't see the same connection as we see in New York between income at the local level per borough or per district in the case of Madrid and the incidence of the pandemic. So the pandemic is going to bring transformations, and we're still grappling with them. So the question is, what are the forces that are providing this change, both at the macro level, so across territories, but also at the microgeographic level, which is within territories. And what we have here is that I'm going to have to make predictions. This is an ongoing pandemic. So the data are changing every day. The evidence is changing. Hopefully vaccination would make inroads all over the world and improve the situation quickly. But we cannot wait until to make analysis and see what we have to prepare for what's going to happen afterwards and the recovery right now. So this implies making predictions. And unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't think anyone has a crystal ball. But we can say that the territorial impact would depend on a series of factors that we have to consider. First is the duration of the pandemic. When we were told in most parts of the Western world, what happened before in Wuhan in January 2020, but then in March, when most of the Western world went into a closure, no one thought that this was going to last as long as it had lasted. We're all hoping that it's going to end up soon, but it might last relatively long. There will be other factors that are very important. The social and the political conditions in each territory, in each country, in each region and city is going to make a difference. How prepared are we? How solid are our institutions to fight the pandemic? So the institutional conditions also matter. And there's another factor that we cannot avoid, which is the question of luck. Why the pandemic struck some parts of the world more than others. It might be down to a lot of other factors, but luck plays a role. So making any prediction is going to be risky. But as I said before, we need to make predictions and we need to take some risks, informed risk on the basis of the evidence we have. We have three types of forces of change that seem to be affecting the way the geography in the post-pandemic world is going to evolve. The first one is that the pandemic is leading to social scarring. What is it meant by social scarring? Is the fear by individuals and by quite a few individuals to be in public places that is being developed in the pandemic. So lengthy confinements are creating social problems, but they are also creating psychological problems. We are much less at the moment, we're more much less inclined at the moment than we were not that long ago to actually interact with other people. We interact at a distance, etc. So that is going to perhaps permeate into behavior in the post-pandemic world. The second one is that we have had to implement, especially in our physical space, changes in order to maintain social distance. There have been transformations in the way we teach, in the way we shop, in the way we sit in restaurants, in the way we sit in terraces, in the way we travel both across the world by airplane, but also within our cities when taking public transport, for example. And the third one is the results of the forced social experiment that has plunged large parts of the world into lockdown. And this is, I'm going to take the words of Franco that was mentioning, this has implied significant changes in first the way we work, the way we have seminars like the one we're having right now, that is a global seminar, but we're not all in Rome, or we are all sitting in our rooms, in our offices, home offices, doing a seminar, in the way we shop and in the way we interact. And many of those changes are going to last. So when you put all this together and you put it across different territories, what are the implications? Well, first, these are changes I have highlighted. They're going to be changes in the way we shop, changes in the way we work in large numbers, and changes in the way we interact. And you're all familiar with all of this. And the implications might be important for the way we configure our physical space and the way we behave in physical space. Just some figures, for example, before the pandemic, in a country like Norway, for which I've been doing quite a lot of analysis, which is not a country where Amazon has got active on the place there. What we find is that in 2019, the year before the pandemic, there was no growth in retail commerce, in retail trade, but online commerce grew by 40%. So before the pandemic, we were all switching massively already to internet shopping in all ways. With the pandemic, this has accelerated massively. And what we're starting to see, and there's a picture from what's happening in the UK, is that spaces in retail, this is what my colleague Richard Florida calls the retail apocalypse, are being vacated because they're no longer viable. And they are concentrated in certain parts of our cities. So what we're going to see is a loss of physical space, especially of small retail shops in city centers more than anything, also cities big and small. Many large retail complexes also suffering as a result, and a bigger transformation. So the pandemic has turbocharged the whole transformation towards online shopping. Distance working, remote working is probably here to stay. It's not that we're not going to go back to the offices. Once this is over, many of us are going to return, and many of us are actually longing to return. But it's probably the case because there are advantages, or certain advantages, that workers have appreciated. There are certain advantages to firms. There's also the evidence that sometimes, if not always, productivity has not declined massively with remote working, that there would be mixed systems in which people will go to the office for certain days, but work from home or from elsewhere, wherever they are, other days of the week. That would also liberate a lot of offices, office space, which mainly would affect city centers. And of course, there would be differences in the way we interact. Restaurants are not going to remain empty for very long, but probably there's going to be more reluctance to travel long distances to go to restaurants. In the future, there's going to be more local restaurants, and there's going to be also more entertaining at home once this is over. So when you put all this together, this might have impacts on territories. And here's where we enter into predictions. What about the macrogeography? What is going to happen in the relationship of territories, in the hierarchy of territories? And here what we can say is that there are going to be changes. Let me just start by saying that I don't believe that we're going to have a much more even geography after the pandemic. The pandemic seems to be feeding, albeit with differences depending on countries, on the poorest of the poor, both in terms of income distribution, but also poor territories seem to be less prepared, less capable to fend off not just the health challenges, but also the economic and social challenges that the pandemics are generating. So this idea that we're going to have a more even distribution, a happier sort of territories, is probably not going to materialize. We cannot hope that the pandemic, just by magic, is going to solve the problems of economic development. And I'm going to go back into that in a moment. probably many cities are still going to go steam ahead as they have done for the last 3 decades. It's not going to happen everywhere, but many cities have got, large cities have got significant advantages. They create positive externalities, they concentrate talent, they attract investment, they generate more innovation, knowledge that then can be diffused, and many of them are going to remain the hubs and the motors of economic activity. And in many cases, what we're going to see is perhaps even an even greater polarization than what we have seen until now between large cities and medium-sized cities, small cities and towns. It doesn't mean that medium-sized and small town cities are not going to thrive. There are quite a few that are going to thrive. But on the whole, probably on the balance, is going to be still tilted towards the large cities. Rural areas and towns are probably going to lose more. There are some that are going to benefit, those that are more accessible to large cities or even to prosperous medium-sized cities, those that have got better amenities and offer a better quality of life, but not all are going to be able to compete and many are going to lose out. So probably at the macro level, we're going to see relative limited changes with respect to the trends that we have seen recently. What about at the microgeography level? What is going to happen? Probably the biggest changes are going to happen within cities. Less office space or less demand for office space, less need for retail space within cities, less leisure space, more need for open space. It means that probably the biggest hit is going to be taken within the city and especially within the city center. That is going to change. There might be a change in uses, probably more cultural uses. There might be a change in habitation, because perhaps at the beginning with some decline in house prices and real estate prices. But this might be a transformation and taken as an opportunity by other groups to move into areas that have become more accessible, more empty, and probably a bit more affordable. Suburbs might win at the beginning. And what we're going to see is a shift in some cases in the sort of activities and the sort of functions that are happening there. So this is where we need to be thinking, because a lot of the transformations and a lot of the policies that we're going to have to implement is saying, how do we rethink the city and the interaction within the city? And there's a lot going on. We're talking about the 15-minute cities. We're talking about open cities, creative cities. We're talking about leisure cities and cultural cities. There has been a lot of discussion about new residential uses and also about how to make transport much more sustainable, but also safer, and with balances or with different approaches of some that are actually promoting bigger use of the car, where others are shifting to other forms of transport big time, like for example, the bicycle or the scooter or other alternatives. So what's the role for infrastructure investment in all this? After all, this is you are going to be discussing infrastructure, so I'd like to say a few words about this part. First is, when we talk about COVID and the pandemic, we cannot hope and we cannot expect that COVID is going to solve pre-existing development problems by magic, as if like magic. So we will need to act. COVID is probably in many cases going to accelerate some of the problems that were simmering, that were already there, but we thought were going to take, the transformations were going to take some time and they were not going to explode. So COVID is going to increase the necessity or the need to act right now. Because otherwise the risk is of greater polarization and rising discontent, as what we have seen in many parts of the world. So the emergence of the Gilets jaunes, mainly coming from areas that have been losing out for some time, is not going to go away, but is going to be reproduced in many areas. So we have seen those sort of reactions in places like as far away as Chile, for example. And we will need development strategies to tackle them. We'll need development strategies that have been implemented for many years in many places, but we will probably need them more than ever. But they will have to be much more integrated within different types of territories. I mean, there would be transformations within big cities. There would be very different from what will happen in declining places, long-term declining places. There will be very different from what will happen in medium-sized cities and from what will be taking place in rural areas. So we will need integrated strategies at the territorial levels, with infrastructure investment being one of the main pillars, together with more emphasis on institutions, but also on improving the human capital, labor skills, the capacity of local firms and the local economic fabric to compete, to innovate, and also the attraction of inward investment, the attraction of talent, and all those other factors. But one thing that is becoming more and more evident, and was already evident before the pandemic, and it's reflected in some of the research I have been doing in the past, is that perhaps the emphasis that we have had in terms of infrastructure on big infrastructural projects that was dominant in the past, very often fancy projects, glitzy projects, is probably going to be counterproductive given the sort of transformations. It was already not working. I put a lot of examples from my home country, but I am Spanish after all. My home country has got probably the best network of transport infrastructure in the world. So massive endowment of motorways, second network in the world after China in high-speed rail, large number of international airports, etc. But despite 25 years, 30 years, the country has not taken off because it has forgotten about other parts. But it can be worse. So there can be a lot of high levels of investment, and with money actually not delivering, or resources not delivering the right infrastructure, like for example in the case of Greece, that took the best of 40 years to finish the main motorway between Thessaloniki and Athens, or even south of Italy, where some projects also took a long term. So that's the Salerno-Reggio Calabria motorway, for example. And we are also seeing that the returns of infrastructure policies very often vary enormously depending the type of projects and the quality of institutions in those projects. In the case of regions in Europe, what we have found, and this is work I've been doing with Riccardo Crescenzi and Marco Di Cataldo, we found that in places where you have actually relatively weak institutional quality, where your government efficiency is low, where there are high levels of corruption, where there's low levels of respect for the rule of law, the preference has always been for big infrastructure projects. You go for the glitzy motorway. You go for the big project that is visible and that might yield returns, either in terms of bribes or perhaps in terms of electoral returns when you go to the polls. But the impact of that type of investment in terms of generation of jobs, in terms of economic growth, has tended to be relatively small, if not negative. A country like Portugal has got, even above Spain, the highest endowment of motorways in the world, but it hasn't grown for the best of the last 2 decades. By contrast, what we are finding is that in the case of areas of Europe with a much better institutional quality, they have often chosen secondary roads to address bottlenecks in preference to highways. And that tendency to look into activity or interventions that actually have addressed existing bottlenecks has yielded much greater returns in terms of employment and in terms of economic growth, productivity, and even innovation. And then also, the emphasis in the past has been very often in transport infrastructure. When we are seeing that when we start doing the analysis, other types of infrastructure like digital infrastructure, but especially social infrastructure, seems to be playing a big role. Investments in, let's say, hospitals, which are necessary during the pandemic, but more investments in issues like, for example, better schools, more access to basic services, more access to public services, seem to be not just yielding greater economic returns, but also increasing the satisfaction of citizens and the well-being of citizens after infrastructure investment. So what can we conclude from this? Well,
we need to come to a conclusion. Yeah.
Yes, I'll finish in a minute. The first one is that although the pandemic is offering or is providing a big transformation, it's providing a big challenge to the territorial systems across the world, large cities are not going to die. They're going to be transformed. And many of the characteristics that made the cities thrive and whether past pandemics would remain in operation. We've seen that cities like Paris or cities like Chicago, New York were reinvented after relatively large, or London, cholera epidemics in the 19th century. The hierarchy of cities will more or less more likely remain in place, the hierarchy between cities and regions, and it would be naive to think that the pandemic alone is likely to address the huge problems of lagging behind cities and regions. Many of the pre-existing tendencies will be accelerated, loss of retail space, distant working that would remain in place. And this will liberate many inner city space in which there will be transformations, especially at the microgeographic level within regions rather than across regions, and especially within cities, with city centers perhaps losing initially, and I say initially because there will be a transformation, and suburbs may be winning at the beginning. So we might see a new flourishment of suburbs as we saw from the 1920s to the 1970s. And also the pandemic, with all its problems, with its horrific toll, it offers a window of opportunity to rethink how we promote development. How do we tackle inequality? And how do we address the problems that are linked to it? So there's a need to rethink our policies and rethink them well, with more attention to integrated policies and also more attention to the micro scale, especially within regions, but without forgetting that the importance of intervening across regions. And infrastructure will have a crucial role in this new world, but it would be a role that is different. It would have to be much more integrated, not as a standalone policy, but with other territorial policies, much more geared towards addressing local bottlenecks than providing large mega projects, and to make sure that within this integrated strategies, it is done in a way that ensures that we end up with a fairer and more just world, not one in which infrastructure may contribute, as it has sometimes in the past, to foster greater polarization between territories and as a result also between individuals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andres, for this very, very interesting presentation. And I'm very pleased that you confirm how right is our approach to local and infrastructures. When we started this exercise, we were asked why the G20 should focus on local infrastructure. And you confirmed that this is actually the right approach if we really want to address the issues of poverty and also to better prepare the world for a post-COVID phase. Now we have to move to the next step. As you said, there is obviously a need for infrastructure, local infrastructure. It is not just transport and urban systems, but social infrastructures like hospitals, schools, houses for the elderly. And we all know, unfortunately, that the challenges that subnational authorities face are even higher than those at national level because of their usually more limited fiscal capacity, the greater difficulty to attract private investors, sometimes the limited administrative capacity. So to better understand the bottlenecks that local governments and local municipalities face and how they are reacting to the current challenges, we have asked Debora Revoltella to present the results of a very interesting municipality survey that she has conducted at the European Investment Bank over the summer of 2020, which includes 685 municipalities across EU member states. Debora is the director of the economics department of the European Investment Bank and has held this position since April 2011. Of course, her analysis refers to European countries, but the methodology she used and some of the conclusions I think could be very, very useful also for similar analysis on a global scale. So Deborah, I hand it over to you. We have, you have about 10 minutes, 11, but I hope you can stay in this. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you very much, and I'm really happy to have an opportunity for presenting the results of our studies. I think I have a presentation that somebody should share on your side. Okay, I see it coming. Perfect. I still cannot. Okay, sorry. Well, that's the complexity of the technicality. So we tried, but I'm always a little bit uneasy at the start. So what I wanted to do in my 10 minutes is to make an example of how we are reasoning at the European level, looking at local investment, and particularly investment of municipalities in the COVID era and at time of the green and digital transitions. The key message that I wanted to pass is that COVID is in fact enhancing pre-existing challenges that were already quite relevant at local level, and the challenges were coming from the green and digital transition with the enormous also social implication and investment and infrastructure needs that the municipalities were facing. And as said, it's only enhanced these needs, and so it's extremely important at the policy level to take into consideration how to deal with this in this moment and how to make the policy effort the most effective possible. And that's what I will do in the next 10 minutes. So the first one is to talk about public investment. And the question that I have is this time different? Is this crisis different from what we know? Then I will look at the local infrastructure gaps, what we see from our surveys, both resulting from the legacy of past years underinvestment and the challenge of green and digital, but also the new needs emerging post-COVID. And then the third point is what does it take to make a difference this time? So how can we make sure that this time the policy reaction really go where it's needed? I start with my first point. So can this time be different? Here I'm talking about public investment in general. I think there is a strong debate among policymakers and economists in this moment on the sustainability of debt when debt increases because of fiscal policy and fiscal policy related to investment activities. I think there is very much a consensus that we are in a condition in which with ultra low interest rates, we can afford some more supportive policies if those are directed to public investment that is growth enhancing. There is, and this is a quite important change in the mentality in the moment in which what we have seen looking at the European experience in the last 40 years, every time that we saw fiscal expansion also related to investment, after a while a fiscal consolidation episode was coming, and every time that a fiscal consolidation is coming, public investment gets deprioritized in the public expenditure, and actually even after 10 years of a fiscal consolidation event, public investment remains below trend. So there is quite some regularity in all countries at the EU level to show that when fiscal consolidation comes, public investment end up being the victim of this. So it's very important that this time we consider it different, and we continue to keep this very strong focus on public investment, something that at the current moment is confirmed in all the budget of all the European member states, but is something that needs to be confirmed in the medium to longer terms. But then if this time is different, so if this time we will keep this focus on public investment going forward, how can we take the most out of it? And here the important message is also on implementation capacity. So committing to public expenditure, public investment, expenditure is not all. It's important to have a proper planning, coordination to maximize the spillover, also address the barrier and the bottlenecks that prevent implementation of the public expenditure in public investment. And also, when planning, making sure that the complementarity of public and private investment is taken into consideration in order to maximize the impact. So that's my starting point, and the starting point is this time should be different. So after what we have seen, the crisis that we have seen, we should really keep this focus on public investment and make it as effective as possible. I move to the second point. So this is really coming from our survey, looking at local infrastructure gaps. So as Franco was saying, we interviewed more than 700 municipalities at the European level over the summer, asking where did they see investment gaps. There are quite some interesting results. This is just showing this slide is just showing the effect of a crisis. This was the last global financial crisis, a decade of very low infrastructure investment, and also the component of local investment was affected. But then when we look at the municipality level, we ask to European municipalities if they feel they have some infrastructure gaps. We have more than 50% of European municipalities that tell us that in fact they have investment gaps. And this is also very different across different parts of Europe, with much stronger needs perceived in Southern and Central Eastern Europe versus Western Europe. But then when we look at where these investment gaps are, they are mostly related to climate change mitigation and adaptation, digital infrastructure, and urban transport. Post-COVID, municipalities tend to deprioritize what is related to climate change mitigation and adaptation, but continue to have a focus on digital, transport, and other social infrastructure at the local level. So it's also important to think that if we are committed to the green transition, also extra support for keeping the focus on climate change is important. The second graph shows something interesting. We ask a municipality if they have developed the capacity on the one side to manage the green transition. So if they have the structure to plan toward the green budget at the municipal level, etc. A number of questions to check if they have the capacity to deal with this. And then the second part is we ask them if they are digital, if they provide digital services. What you see is in the graph is who is not green and not digital. You have more than almost 70% of the European municipalities that are non-green. They cannot deal with the technicalities of the green transition, and 44% that are non-digital, non-providing digital services. Even in Europe, that's a lot of a gap in terms of administrative capacity at the municipality level. We ask municipalities what are their barriers to investment. The first is showing the general barrier to investment, and here there is a lot. If we look at what they consider major obstacle, the major obstacle remains a lack of funding. But if we look at everything that is an obstacle, we also have a lot of issues related to regulation length, regulation uncertainty, coordination, technical capacity, a number of factors that tell you that funding is clearly a problem, but there is a lot also in terms of administrative capacity and regulation that is preventing investment at the local level to take place. Focusing only on green investment, funding seems to be the main issue for municipalities, but also I have to say that our perception is that at the municipality level, still there is not that much a focus on the green transition in this moment. Another point, I was mentioning the importance of internalizing this complementarity between public and private and public investment and local investment, particularly related to the green and digital transition. What we find out is that it's only a correlation, but when in municipalities that are more advanced in green and digital, you tend to have more firms that are ready to start the green and digital journey. So there seems to be some correlation between municipalities and firms in terms of moving together in terms of embracing into this transition. And the other point that I wanted to mention is that if the green and digital transition is an enormous challenge, it also offers opportunity. We have seen that the green transition may create 1.1 million jobs by 2030 in terms of clean energy employment, and this needs to be exploited. So advancing in the transition means also taking this opportunity, and at the same time also moving fast on digital, also at the municipality level, may be important because of the correlation private and public performance in digitalization, and also because at that point, digital firms are actually, they do better and they are more optimistic also on the job creation effect on new digital technologies. So moving fast in this digital and green transition at the local level may have a positive effect and may help to unlock opportunity, while still being a challenge, but the challenge is there and needs to be addressed. So I get to my last point. What does it take to make a difference? So this time seems to be different. This time there is much more commitment to public investment, and there is a full new narrative on the importance of keeping a public investment in the post-crisis. We have local infrastructure gaps. We see the needs that are related to existing, pre-existing gaps in terms of infrastructure, adding to the digital and green transition with the need that the digital and green transition have, and then the COVID pandemic adding on top. So we have the gaps. What does it take to make a difference this time? And I think my focus is very much on the implementation. I think the focus should really be in maximizing the absorbing capacity and making sure that the investment is really addressed to the major needs. Local investment is an essential part of this current investment strategy, and I think there is a growing literature showing that the local multipliers can actually exceed the aggregate one if the autonomies foster improved project identification and implementation. But then it also requires very much addressing the barriers, and as I was saying, the barriers are on funding on the one side, but also very much in terms of the planning and the coordination and the governance on the local public investment process that is there. Yes, I'm closing. So the maximizing. I think what I was saying is really the governance, the planning, prioritization, using a life cycle approach, incorporating sustainability when planning the infrastructure, and then also coordination among different actors is quite important along various dimensions. And on this, I wanted to just put an accent that even at the European level, the preparation of a municipality in terms of ex-ante assessment and coordination is somehow still lagging. To conclude, I think the message is that the local infrastructure is an essential element of a coherent investment strategies, and it's equally important to address both the funding needs, but also the ramping up the absorptive capacities. And there is a rule for institutions like us that are combining the lending part with the advisory and the sector project expertise, because it's really the combination of the three that will make the public investment more impactful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Debora. Thank you, Debora. Sorry if I had to ask you to conclude. We are sort of running a bit behind schedule, but I think this was very, very useful, very helpful. I particularly appreciated the fact that we have opportunities. It's not just a gloomy picture, which unfortunately it is because of the social dramatic consequence, but there are also opportunities, and what you show that the ones who have more advanced in green and digital transformation are the ones that have perhaps a better future.